This one's going to cover the basic step-by-step of how I use my pressure canner. G'day, it's Rachel here from Bush Edge Homesteading Australia, and welcome to the Basics of Canning series. This episode is all about pressure canning. So I'm going to share with you why you might want to do pressure canning, a bit of the basics and safety principles. We'll talk about the equipment, and I'm also going to give you an absolute step-by-step run through on how to run the pressure canner. So stick with and we'll run through all of that. Let's start off with a bit of a chat about why you might use a pressure canner like this for preserving your food in jars, which is what canning is. It's essentially just preserving food in jars. A pressure canner needs to be used if you are going to preserve any food in jars that is what is called low acid. So that's things like your vegetables that aren't pickled, also a lot of your soups and stews, meats and stuff like that. They're all considered to be low acid foods, and they are foods with a pH of 4.6 or higher. These low acid foods have kind of all those risks of, your molds and yeasts and bacteria that you have in other foods that we jar, that we normally kill with water bath or steam canning. And I've got a couple of other videos in the series that cover those types of canning. But in those other types of canning, we use those for what's called your high acid foods, where you've got a lot of acidity in the food, and that provides some protection against a particular type of bacteria that causes a condition called botulism. But where you don't have the acidity in your food, you've got that additional risk with this type of bacteria. Now, when you boil water or you use steam canning, it only gets up to 100 degrees Celsius. That's not enough to kill that type of bacteria off. And that is why we want to use a steam canner when we're dealing with low acid foods, because you don't have that acidity providing you the protection instead. So we actually need to deal with that bacteria, and you do that by heating up to a higher level than can be achieved just by boiling or steam. In fact, we want to get the temperature up in one of these pressure canners to 116 degrees Celsius or 240 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's the temperature to kind of kill off that harmful bacteria. The pressure canner that I'm using here today is a Presto Pressure Canner, and there is a couple of different ones on the market. This is one of the more common ones, along with the All-American. I went for this one here because it's a little bit smaller, and I actually thought that I might be able to get away with this one on my glass stovetop. Unfortunately, I find that the glass stovetop kind of toggles on and off, and that's why I use this gas burner in my outdoor kitchen. Before I had my biogas set up in the outdoor kitchen, I was using a portable gas burner, and that also worked for me with this one here. Now, while we're talking about the equipment, I do just want to point out that I'm using a weighted gauge on my pressure canner, and I've got this one here set for 10 pounds. Now, depending on what elevation your property is at, you might need a different weight. So if you're at a higher elevation, over 1,000 feet, normally you kind of move up to the 15 pound on that one. And sometimes you can also not use one of these and just use the standard weight that comes with the unit. And when you do that, you then rely on this thing here, which is the dial pressure gauge. With the dial one, you need to rely a bit more on your burner and flame to try and maintain the level of pressure that you're looking for whatever recipe you're doing and the elevation that you're at. So it does require a little bit more management, whereas this one here basically will kind of release a bit of the steam and pressure from within the unit at that level of pressure, dependent on the weight that you've kind of got sitting on top and the weight of that. So that's a bit of a difference between some of these. They do just, as a standard, kind of come with these dial ones with the Prestos. This was an additional thing that I needed to buy. Hopefully that helps with a little bit of an understanding about the safety and the way that these things work. In a nutshell, you're creating pressure in this pot up to a certain level that's required. your processed jars inside, they're going to heat up to that higher level of temperature that you can get with your normal boiling or steam. It's going to get it up to that 116 degrees Celsius or that 240 degrees Fahrenheit that you're looking for to kill off those bad bacteria that you can get in low acid foods. And that's going to mean that the jars that come out of this after you've processed can be put on your shelf and will be nice and shelf stable and safe. So I think that's enough talking about it. Let's get in and run through the step by step. So the first thing I'm going to do is a bit of a check of the pressure canner. I'm also going to take the weight off as well because I don't want that on at this stage. And essentially all I want to do is make sure that the seal is on properly. You want to make sure there's no cracks or anything like that in it as well. That all of the pieces are on properly. And then what we need to do is put some water inside the canner. Actually, before I do that, I might just show you inside it as well, because if you haven't seen inside of one of these before, you might not know that there is a bit of a rack that sits on the bottom. So that's important to make sure that's in place as well. And what that does is it keeps your jars off the bottom of the pot, which helps prevent breakage. Next, we need to put some water in the canner, and we're going to put 3 quarts of water into our pressure canner. The water that I've just put in here is hot water, and that's because I'm doing a hot pack recipe today. So I'm doing tomatoes. They're packed into the jars hot, which means I'm going to have hot product going into hot jars. That means I need a hot canner as well, and that makes sure that I don't get any glass breakage. Here's our tomatoes, and I'm not going to go into how I've canned these tomatoes up today because this isn't a video about canning tomatoes. It's about how to use the pressure canner. But do keep in mind that when you are pressure canning, you should use a recipe that preferably is a tested recipe, and I've used the tomatoes one out of the ball book today. I've done the normal things of making sure that I've got that hot product into hot jars because this is a hot pack recipe, and I've done the normal principles of making sure that I've got the required head space for this recipe, clean those rims, and now I've got these lids on finger tight, so they're now ready to go into the canner. These jars can now go into the pressure canner, and I'm just going to use my jar lifter to do that. Means that I can save my hands from getting too hot, and I just lift those in and sit those on top of the rack. So that's fit 7 of these jars in, and the size that I'm using here today are the 1.5 jars. I get a similar amount in when I'm doing quarts. When you're doing quarts and the 1.5s, you can't double stack because there's not enough height in this Presto. This is the Presto 23. If I'm doing just pints or I'm doing the half pints, you can actually double stack in these. Some people use a rack to do that. I've never really used a rack to do it, and it seems to work perfectly fine that way. Now what I'm going to do is pop the lid on and turn the burner on. Before I put the lid on though, I just want to give the lid a quick check. And that's just to look through this valve here. And that's because this is where the steam is going to escape. So you want to make sure that you can see right through that. And I can, so that's perfectly fine. So now I just want to put the lid on top. Now there is a certain spot where it'll go on nicely. There we go. And then what you do is you twist it to the side, and that kind of locks in the lid and creates a really tight seal. And now I just want to turn my burner on. At this point, you want to have the burner on the highest heat setting because you're trying to bring this up to a boil. You also want to make sure that you've taken your weight off. And that's because at this point, we're waiting till it gets to the point where there's steam that starts to escape. This has got to the point now where I'm starting to see that stream of steam, and it's probably a little bit tricky to see outside here because the wind does blow it away a bit. Now, you need a decent stream of there's a bit of a tongue twister. You need a decent stream of steam coming out. And at that point, you start to measure a 10-minute time period because you need it to steam for 10 minutes. And after that, that's when we'll put the regulator on. Now, how long it takes to get to this point is really going to be different for you and for me. With my biogas burner, it's not a really super high heat, so it does take a little while to get to this point. Whereas for you, you might find on your stovetop it's a bit more powerful and it gets to that point a bit quicker. All right, let's start timing 10 minutes. You might be wondering why we're waiting the 10 minutes with this stream of steam coming out. Well, during this period, the pressure canner is exhausting the air from within the unit. It's not building up the pressure yet though, and we can tell that because this little kind of lock here is still in the downwards position. When it's down, it means that we don't have the pressure built up. It'll actually pop up a little bit later when we've got the pressure built, but we do need to exhaust the air, and that's what we're doing here. 10 minutes has now passed, so it's time to place the weighted gauge on top. So I'm just going to pop that on top here. And what will probably happen is very soon we'll see this little doohickey, and there's a proper word for the doohickey. It's a lock mechanism. It'll pop up, and once that's popped up, it actually means that the lid will be locked in place. And that's a bit of a safety mechanism so that you can't take the lid off when you've got the pressure built up in your pressure canner. That's the locking mechanism now popped up, which means this lid is now secured in place. We've got to continue waiting at this point until we start to see this weighted gauge starting to rock, and that means that the steam's starting to escape out of the valve, and it means at that point it's at pressure and we can start our processing time. That's coming up to pressure. Let me show you one of the safety mechanisms on this, because I hear about people that get a bit stressed about the idea of pressure canners, the pressure build up, and think they're going to explode. This little thing we see at the back here is a safety release valve. So it's basically just like a little plastic piece, and what will happen is if there's a really high level of pressure, that can actually pop straight out and release some of the pressure from within the unit. Now we just got to wait a bit until this starts to jiggle. You can see here on the gauge that we're starting to see the pressure build in here, but because I'm using the weighted gauge, we're not going to use the dial gauge. We can't rely on that one when you're using the weighted gauge. Also, my dial is from my 2013 unit, and if you're in America or somewhere like that, you would get your dial tested and checked, calibrated to make sure that it actually is at the pressure that it's supposed to be. Here in Australia, we just don't have those types of resources available to us. So that's why it probably is actually a better idea in Australia to have one of these weighted ones, because that way you don't have to rely on a dial that could potentially be inaccurate. Pressure's still building. You can see there's a little bit of steam escaping, but we're not at the level we need yet. All right, we're at the point now where we're getting a bit of rocking starting, and that rocking's created because that steam is starting to escape. It's at that pressure that is equal to the weight of that weighted gauge, and now our little weight is starting to do a bit of a hula dance. And it's at this point that we start to measure our processing time. So for this recipe that I'm doing here, my processing time is 15 minutes. Of course, whatever recipe you're using, use the processing time for that specific recipe. This is starting to rock pretty intensely now, and I've got this still on full high heat. So what I'm going to do is actually turn my heat down a little bit, not too much, because I do need to make sure that this continues to rock. If it stops rocking, it means that I've lost the pressure and I'll have to start my processing time again. But if it starts rocking too much, that's where you can back your heat back just a little bit. There we go, that's settled down again a bit. Still rocking, but not quite as intensely. Whilst you're doing your processing, you do want to stay close by so you can make sure that that pressure is maintained and that nothing goes wrong. And that's why it's pretty cool that we have our outdoor kitchen, so I can sit outside, have a cuppa while I'm waiting, and enjoy this magical view. That's our 15-minute processing time, which means it's now time to turn this off. But at this stage, I'm just going to turn it off and have a bit of patience. You don't want to do anything at this stage to try and speed up the cooling of your pressure canner. That can be pretty dangerous. Just have some patience at this point. There is a lot of pressure still built up, even though I've just turned that off. You can tell that by the fact that the lock is still in that upwards position. In fact, there's still some steam coming out of here. If I took that off at this point, the steam would come bursting out. You don't want to do that at this stage either. You want to leave that pressure gauge on. So just leave it at that point. You'll just wait, watch this to see when the lock drops down. You'll also probably be able to tell that there's no steam still escaping from your weighted gauge. You can probably hear that there is some at the moment. And yeah, when those indicators are there that the pressure is gone, that's when we can move to the next stage and take off the lid. I should also say, don't rely on the dial gauge at this point for that, because that's actually a bit of a poor indicator on whether there is still any of the pressure built up in here or not. About a quarter of an hour's now passed, and you can see that on the dial gauge, it's down to the 0. There's no steam coming out of the vent anymore, but the lock is still up, and that means that there is still pressure in here, and I'm still not able to take this lid off, so I need to keep being patient. Now, I shouldn't really do this, but I do want to show you what I mean in terms of there being some steam and pressure still in there. Don't do that, but I just wanted you to see that there is still that pressure in there. If you do things to try and accelerate the cooling and the release of pressure, you do run the risk of stuffing up the jars that you've just spent all this time processing. There is a bit of a cool down period that those jars need to go through. So don't try and accelerate anything, let it cool down naturally. And then once you see this lock go down, we can move to the next stage. I've just come back to check this, and we can see now that the lock is in that downward position. So that means the lid is now unlocked. That means I can now take off our weighted gauge. So I'm just going to take that off. I do still need to be patient at this point though, because we need to wait for 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes of further cooling, that's when we can take this lid off. 10 minutes has passed now since I've taken off that weighted gauge, and that means I can now open up the lid. That's opening nice and easily, which means there's no pressure built up in there. If you did have any pressure starting to release, you probably want to stop at that point, or if it's hard to try and open, that means there's a bit of pressure in there as well. When you take the lid off, it's always a good idea to do so away from you, because even though that pressure has gone, you can see there's still a lot of steam. So facing it away from you gets that steam away from you. Just a bit of a safety tip there. And then all I want to do at this point is take out my jars. So I'm going to use my jar lifting doohickey to get some of those out and just lift them one by one. And then I'm going to pop those on top of my chopping board. They are super hot still at this stage, so that means you want to put them on something so that they don't scald your surfaces. That can damage your bench tops and things like that. So I'll just keep lifting those out until they are all out of the canner. At this stage, sometimes they can also bubble a bit. I'm not seeing that with any of these today, but don't be surprised if you do see the thing that you're processing in the jar bubbling away. It's just a bit of a factor of the pressure, but we're not seeing that here. There's all of our tomatoes out of the canner, and all I want to do now is leave these on the bench for the next 24 hours to cool. At this point, you don't want to disturb them in any way. You definitely don't want to be taking the rings off or mucking around with the lids at all, and that's because at this point they are still quite soft, and you can break the seals that you've just started working so hard to achieve. Oh, actually, something interesting is happening in the back one here. If I can get in here, that's what I was talking about before, where you've got that change in pressure between what's inside your jar and what's on the outside. And also it can be still quite super hot inside those jars, and they can bubble away. So it's exciting that I got to show you that, because that's not an uncommon thing to see. Don't stress if you do see that happening with your jars after you've pulled them out of the canner. These are all looking really good. In terms of troubleshooting though, one thing that can happen if you have a fluctuation in the temperature where it's, like up and down during the processing time, is what's called siphoning. Now there's no sign of that with these ones here, but it is where some of the food that you're processing actually comes out of the jars. That's not too big a deal if you don't lose too much of the food, but it can be a bit of a problem for your seals, especially if you get food trapped between the lid and the glass of the jar and you don't actually get a good seal. But you can avoid that by trying to keep your temperature pretty consistent when you're regulating the temperature during the pressure canning period. We just want to leave them now for the next 24 hours, let those seals harden up, and at that point you can then take the rings off. In fact, you need to take your rings off at that point because you can get a bit of moisture underneath, and that can cause problems if you leave them on long term. So that's really it for the canning run. At this point, you just want to clean out your canner, making sure that you give the lid a bit of a clean. Of course, making sure that that area of the seal is definitely nice and clean. And yeah, then putting it back into its storage spot. Hopefully that helped with sharing with you how to go about doing a bit of pressure canning, and hopefully it gives you the confidence to give it a go too. Thanks for joining, and catch you later.